got some blood right here on her left cheek.
Look at the
It's up on the shoulder,
blade
too.
That's new.
It's all new.
It's like road rash.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he has some kind of road rash.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to True Crime Unsolved. I'm Miles Reef. I'm here as always with my buddy Sean Cahill. This is the place where we tackle the stories that the TV networks won't touch. Unsolved homicides, missing persons cases, stories without an ending. Guys, we're getting into a new case today. This is one that we're going to have a lot of follow-ups on, a lot of interviews with friends. Before we get into the details and sort of lay out what the case is about, I'm going to read a little bit of a disclaimer. Now, you know, if I'm reading a disclaimer up top, we're getting into something really interesting and a little bit sensitive. So sit back, relax, make yourself a drink, whatever you want to do. Let me read this and then we're going to get into it, okay? This podcast contains information drawn from public records, media reporting, and interviews with individuals connected to the case. Some statements reflect personal recollections and opinions of those individuals. No one has been convicted of a crime in connection with the death discussed in this episode, and the listeners should not interpret this discussion as a determination of guilt. Now, having said that, Sean, let's get into it.
Yeah, so your disclaimer has a lot of good information there. So let's unpack it a little bit. This is a story about a woman named Leanne Beck who died at the age of 33 in circumstances that the people in her life who are close to her and loved her very much feel are extremely questionable. And they're not the only ones. I guess I should get it out of the way up top that there was an investigation into her death, right? By police who thought maybe this is a homicide. Let's try to get to the bottom of it. At the conclusion of that investigation, the investigators recommended homicide charges in this case. What's interesting about it is that the county attorney in Maricopa County, Arizona, declined to take this case. They said that they did not feel like there was a very good chance of getting a conviction. So you can see, even within the government and the people charged with investigating and prosecuting crimes, there's a disagreement on how to proceed with Leanne Beck's death. I think the best way to sum it up is what's actually written in the medical examiner's report, Miles. It says, cause of death, blunt force trauma to the back of the head. That is how Leanne died. But the circumstances surrounding it are undetermined, meaning we don't know if this was an accident. We don't know if somebody did this to her. We cannot tell how she got these injuries, but we do know that those are what killed her. Now, the question becomes basically, let's look at everything we know about Leanne's life, the circumstances leading up to her final night, and what we can determine about that final night, because we don't have all the answers. We have some versions of the answers and what investigators were able to dig up. And then we're just going to talk about that. And following this sort of breakdown of the information that, by the way, like Miles said, is all coming from public records, right? Medical examiners reports, police reports, body cam footage, all of this is on paper. And some, more personal stuff is from her friends. We're going to cover all of that in this case breakdown to give you, in a nutshell, what Leanne's story is, and then follow it over the next couple of weeks with some really in-depth interviews with her friends, just to get more context on her personal life and how this whole thing has affected them. So, again, to be clear, we're not saying that this was a homicide. We don't know. I think that's the crux of the issue. We're not pointing the finger at anybody, and nobody has been charged with anything. But Leanne's story was interesting enough. We were reached out to basically by people who love Leanne and put in touch with her friends who wanted to go public and talk about her story. And Miles and I really took a long time looking through all these documents and reading the case files to sort of figure out, is this even the right fit for True Crime Unsolved? And ultimately, we decided that we think it is. Not because it's necessarily for sure an unsolved murder, but because Leanne's story is so unresolved as far as just what happened to her, right? It's not for sure someone murdered her who did it. It's what happened to this young lady, and can we learn more? It feels like the conclusion of this investigation has left everyone in her life feeling extremely unsatisfied. So maybe by hearing all this, you guys can help us come to some sort of a conclusion. Maybe you'll have your own theories. We'll get to that at the end. Miles, I think I've given a long preamble there. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about Leanne Beck and her life, and let's dive in.
Okay. So Leanne died on August 29th, 2021. She was 33 years old when she died. Okay. She was from Arizona. She was an only child. Everyone who knew her growing up said that she became she would become very close with her cousins, with her sister. She was always forming like very, very close relationships. A lot of people said that that was probably down to the fact that she didn't have any siblings and she was kind of always craving that kind of closeness in her life. There's a great quote from her dad that basically said that even as a child, she was doing things differently. And the quote is, she didn't want to play softball, she wanted to play baseball. So, obviously, girl, softball, Leanne wanted to play baseball. And her friends say that that determination and that sort of tenaciousness and walking to the beat of her own drum kind of followed her into adulthood. Now, Leanne had a very interesting career. Leanne worked at the Mayo Clinic in Arizona, and she was an organ transplant procurement coordinator. So basically, she was helping to coordinate organ donations and transplant procedures. So this is someone who's like interfacing with folks who are donating organs, also, managing situations where people have expired and they're organ donors, and connecting that with the folks who need the organs. And this is a very time sensitive thing. This is a very emotionally sensitive thing. This is a very high pressure, very sensitive, for lack of a better word, job to have. We spoke to a lot of Leanne's friends that she worked with. In fact, most of the people that we've interviewed in the interviews that you guys are going to see coming up in the next couple of weeks actually were Leanne's coworkers. And when you work in that kind of situation, I'm sure some of our viewers work in these, anybody who's a fireman, a cop, a nurse, anybody who works under these extreme pressures, EMT guys, you form really, really close bonds because you really rely on each other, right? And you're working incredibly long hours. The shifts are weird. So these guys, they really did, create like their own sort of like alternative family at work, right? And they all kind of relied on each other. And for everybody that we talked to, Leanne was super dedicated to her job. She was really good at it, and she was someone that you could always turn to, and that you could count on her to do her job. For everyone, it said she was very compassionate. She was very committed to helping others, which obviously played into her going into this line of work because you're literally helping others, connect with life-saving procedures, right? Um, the thing that all of Leanne's friends told us was that there was a turning point in her life where her life became about something else. And that was when she became a mother. And I think that's sort of the next phase of her biography. And I'm going to throw it to Sean to kind of lay that out because it is a little bit complex, to say the least. Like Leanne's circumstances of being a mom, they're kind of interesting.
Yeah. So at the time of her death, Leanne had two children, but they were not both from the same man. So let's start with the first one. Her daughter, which was born in May of 2019, was from a former relationship with a guy named Nate. They ultimately decided to go their separate ways during this pregnancy. And so when their daughter was born, they were no longer together, although they had a co-parenting arrangement and both parents were in the life of the child, which is great. I mean, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn when I say, the middle of a pregnancy is not an ideal time for a relationship to break down. But Leanne did that and dealt with it, and it seems like the best, most responsible way that she could, as did the father of their daughter. But what's interesting in Leanne's life during this timeline is she wound up reconnecting with a man that she knew from high school whose name was Jason Beck. Right after the birth of her daughter. And this quickly turned into a romantic situation. So the daughter's born in May, and by summertime of 2019, Leanne is engaged to Jason Beck. And so her friends thought this was interesting, right? You'll see it in the interviews. It's obviously a kind of a strange timeline. Most of us don't imagine the postpartum period as being one where we're rekindling a romance or perhaps rekindling for the first time a romance. But that is what happened with Leanne. And things just moved really quickly from there with Jason. Miles, do you want to take us through a little bit of the next steps here? Because the timeline continues to get interesting.
Yeah, I mean, look, people get together in different ways, right? Some people take years to, commit. Some people go on and off, break up and get back together. Some people jump right in and it works out, right? Leanne and Jason, they had what I would call a rapid timeline, okay? And I'm going to walk you guys through that rapid timeline. So in August 2019, that's probably around when they actually got pregnant with what is going to be Leanne's second child, okay? In October 2019, they actually publicly announced that pregnancy. February 2020, they officially get married, and in May 2020, they actually have a child. They have a son. So at that point, Leanne has two children. She has the daughter that she had with Nate, and now she's got a son with Jason, right? So both and those two kids are under the age of two because she's basically had them back to back. So
Within almost a year exactly, it seems like May
yeah, yeah,
2019, in May of 2020.
exactly. So it's probably like, what does that give her? Like 3 months from, when she had the first kid to when she got pregnant. Again, no judgment. It's just interesting. And it's, it's something that, is a fact, and, we're just laying it out.
I think it just shows really quickly, Miles. I think it just shows the intensity of the relationship that had developed between her and Jason, right? Because that it's like into the deep end. It almost feels like, from meeting this person and rekindling something from the past to boom, married to boom, a kid, all within this short timeline. That's why it's worth noting, I guess, to us.
Right, and as two guys with young kids, and obviously wives who had those kids, we know what they were like right after they had our kids. So those first few months after a woman gives birth, are usually pretty difficult. It's something to note. So again, after this son is born to Jason and Leanne in May 2020. Friends start saying that they start seeing some changes in Leanne at this point. Okay. So everybody that we've talked to said universally pretty much that communication with Leanne began to change shortly after the relationship began. But like after the child was born, that's when things got really, really weird. Their texts would go unanswered, phone calls wouldn't get returned. Some said that they couldn't even reach Leanne on her personal phone anymore, that they would have to call her on her work phone. And her coworkers orders also started noticing some strange behaviors as well. Um, they reported that Jason would actually like call her at work and check in on who she was working with, who she was sharing shifts with. He would ask which doctors were present in the operating room, who she had mentioned at home and who she may have been like working with at night. Just kind of like jealous, controlling stuff by all accounts. At that time, a lot of people just assumed, well, they just had a kid. Things are pretty crazy. There's changes. They just got together. Things are still new. They put it down to that. But over time, things got a little more serious, and there's things on the record that I think we need to talk about. So there's police records that show that the cops responded to the couple's home on multiple occasions. Now, those sometimes it was kind of what the police reports say, there was kind of like mutual fighting going on sometimes at the house. There was one instance where Leanne had actually left the home, and like they found her kind of like walking pretty far away from the home. There were two times where Jason was arrested on domestic violence charges stemming from those the police calls at the house. One time, Leanne was also arrested. So there was one time where they were both taken away, and there was one time where Jason was taken away by himself, and there were DV charges put on him because of that. So coworkers around this time say that Leanne started collecting evidence about what was going on in her home, in her relationship. So friends that we've talked to said that Leanne started taking photos of injuries, that she actually sent messages, text messages, and screenshots of these injuries to her friends, screenshots of text messages, controlling messages, stuff like that. And she asked her friends to kind of like hold on to that information, in case something happened down the line. Some people that we spoke to who were coworkers of Leanne actually said that she came up with a code word that basically if she texted this code word to them, they were supposed to call the police and have them come to her home because something bad had happened. So, by all accounts, from the people that we've spoken to and by some of the evidence that they've shown us, it does seem that Leanne was trying to create a record. Well, she was trying to create a record of what was going on in her home, and she was also trying to create fail safes in case something really, really bad happened. And as I said, there were multiple police calls at the house. There were domestic violence charges against both of them, but more against Jason. So early 2021, Leanne tries to leave the relationship. She's pretty much had it by all accounts. So February 2021, she files for an order of protection. March 2021, she files a separation paperwork. In June of that year, she moves in with her father, and she actually like files for a full divorce. So according to her father, and this is a quote, he says she was done after June 5th. She was done. This point, according to all of her friends, everyone that we've spoken to, Leanne was determined to kind of move on with her life at this point. She had done the work of kind of documenting everything, all of her fears, whatever had happened between her and Jason. She had filed the order, successfully gotten the order of protection. She had the domestic violence charges against him to back that up. Obviously, that helped her get the order of protection. She had moved in with her dad. She had taken her child and her other child with her. And she was ready to move on with her life and end the relationship with Jason and move in a new direction.
Right on. And it's so interesting because, you can see from everything we talked about that this relationship was obviously and on paper troubled, right? I mean, we have police reports, we have domestic violence stuff, we have a protection order ultimately at the end of it, and we have a young mother moving in with her own dad just to get away from the situation. So I don't think many people would call that an ideal thing. But what's interesting is that the last night Leanne was alive, she reconnected with Jason. So we talked to her friends about this and tried to figure out why they thought maybe she would go out and see Jason after all of this trouble had happened between them. And it just felt like it wasn't in a good place. And the truth is, nobody really has a good answer for this. It just seems like from the outside, everyone's best guess is they had a connection that even though it was troubled and even though there had been all this drama between them, it still wasn't quite severed. It's possible that they needed to discuss something related to co-parenting their son, who was, a baby at this point. It's possible that they simply missed each other like people do, even in troubled relationships, even when there's been a lot of drama and there's a lot of anger and sadness. Sometimes we're able to look past that and agree to get together and have a drink and talk. And it seems like maybe that's what was going on here. Either way, the point is that Leanne and Jason did get together and go out for drinks on August 28th of 2021. So let's break down the timeline of what we know about how this night went between the two of them. Ultimately, we don't know everything that was discussed or what the purpose of it was, but we do have some hard facts, right, Miles? So the final 2 hours here, Leanne and Jason go out drinking at multiple locations. They're together. It looks like they're having fun at some point. Leanne seemed fine physically. There was no injuries on her. She was just a normal person at a bar talking to somebody and having drinks. But ultimately, Leanne does leave with Jason and they go back to Jason's house. The last communication from her, though, comes sort of after, they were out on the evening of the 28th. Now it's in the early hours of August 29th, right? 2, 3 a.m., that kind of time. And a text message goes out to her friends saying that she has abdominal pain and she's not going to be coming into work in the morning, which they all said was a really unusual thing for her to send, especially at that time and especially about that. But it came from her phone and it arrived with some friends. Now, what happens 20 minutes after that text message is sent is a 911 call from Jason Beck. So, Miles, let me throw it back to you. Walk us through that 911 call and what ultimately happens here, because this is where things get interesting.
Right. Now, this is 3:07 a.m. on the morning of the 29th. It's 20 minutes after the text message goes out to the coworker saying that she's having abdominal pain. Jason Beck calls 911. Now, according to the dispatcher in the statement to the police who investigated this whole matter, Jason sounded frantic. He said that Leanne was not breathing and that she had been throwing up and that she was not breathing, and he sounded very excited and very frantic. Now, first responders show up on the scene. We do have body cam footage of that. We're going to show that. We're going to show some of that to you guys. We have hours and hours of body cam footage from the scene. We're going to pick out some choice bits and we're going to show you guys. It's going to support some of what we're saying here, but I'm going to walk you guys through sort of what the first responders saw, what's in the police reports, and what we've heard ourselves from watching those from watching the body cam footage. Okay, so when they show up, Jason is performing CPR on Leanne. She's naked. She's She's prone, she's on the ground, and Jason's on top of her, and she's performing CPR. Jason's mother is present in the home, okay? So first responders see her, they communicate with her. Now, she lives right next door. So the homes are actually like, right next to each other. Jason's mom's over here. Jason's house, where Leanne used to live, is right next door. According to Leanne's friends, the people that we've interviewed, Jason's mom actually owned the properties. Jason told the investigators that he'd actually called his mother before he called 911. Now remember, 20 minutes before 911, text message goes to the friend, I'm not coming into work, I'm having abdominal pain. So the main living area opens up into a dining room, okay? I'm going to try to give you guys a mental picture of what we're looking at here. So investigative materials that we have seen and that some of the friends have seen as well, there's reference to a mop bucket that's sitting in the dining room of the home. Okay, there's with water in it. The water inside the bucket, from what we can find and from police records, it was never tested. So it's just something to note. The EMT guys, the first responders who show up on the scene, they notice that Leanne's got several injuries on her body. Like, they noticed this right away. From their examination, she had been dead for a while. Like, that was their assessment of the situation. She was cold, and she had probably passed away quite a bit of time before they actually showed up. She was cold to the touch. They also said, and we'll play you some video here, that there's some blood on her left cheek that's not consistent with her being in the state that she's in. And you can hear the guys talking, like they're noticing things that don't seem right.
She's got some blood right here on her left cheek.
Look at the
It's up on the shoulder,
blade.
too.
Too. That's new.
It's all new.
Looks like road rash.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she has some kind of road rash.
Just from the sound of their voices and from what they're saying. So they examine her further and they notice more injuries on Leanne's body. Okay, I'm going to kind of go through those for you guys. So she had scrapes on her lower back that were described in the reports as being consistent with road rash. Again, scrapes on her lower back that were consistent with road rash. She had abrasions on her shoulder blades. She had injuries to the heels of her feet. And I think this is most important. She had a golf ball sized lump on the back of her head. Now, remember, Sean had mentioned at the beginning, and we're going to go through the medical examiner's report soon, the cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. She had a golf ball sized injury on the back of her head. So Leanne's pronounced dead at the scene. The paramedics who showed up, the EMT guys, they pronounced her dead. So I'm just going to go through some things that were missing from the scene, because obviously this is treated as a potential crime scene and it's investigated as such. Now, there are certain things that most people would have with them that Leanne does not have, okay? So those items included her phone, her debit card, her car key fob, and her Apple Watch. Now, friends have told us that those items were later located in a drawer in Jason's mother's home, which was the home next door. There's another unexplained detail, which could be important, it could be not, but Leanne's shoes were never found.
Yeah, there's a lot to wonder about there, right? I mean, if Leanne was, in a state that was worrying everybody there and they called 911, why did they remove those things from her and put them in a drawer in the house next door? Right? If you're worried about somebody, you're calling 911 for help, are you stripping them of their belongings and moving it to another property? It's enough that police have questions. Obviously, not every single 911 call where a person winds up dead turns into a homicide investigation or at least a suspicious death investigation. Plenty of times it doesn't. But this one did, because there were just enough details here that investigators felt like there might be more to the story. How did Leanne get those injuries? Why were her belongings missing? What really went on that night? So the first person they're going to talk to, of course, is Jason, because he's the one that was with her this entire night. He's the one that was performing CPR when they got there, and it's his house and his ex-wife. So if you're an investigator, you're going to start with him. Now, the interesting thing is that He was interviewed several times. Let's talk about his first interview, because this is, basically right after it happened. This is everything that he has to say for himself in that moment. During this first interview, Jason tells the detectives that he did not know how Leanne sustained those injuries. And keep in mind, his 911 call was not about head trauma. It was not about road rash on his ex-wife's body. It was about her throwing up, complaining of stomach trouble, and being unconscious. So it's interesting to note that when they got there, the bigger problem wasn't really vomit, it was a head injury. And so they asked him about that, and he says, I don't know. I have no idea how she got that. He couldn't tell, I think is the quote, how it happened. And look, devil's advocate, it sounds like this was a pretty chaotic night. It sounds like there had been a lot of drinking. It's not inconceivable that somebody might get confused and there might be details present at a scene like that that they can't account for, right? But Jason, obviously, he can't, and they're noting that down. He does suggest that maybe the injuries could have come from rough sex, which he says they did have that night. Road rash like this typically comes from asphalt or cement, and like a higher speed drag or something like that. But that's my own conjecture, and it might have nothing to do with it. There could be another explanation. Anyway, the detectives are noticing the stuff, right? This isn't all about my feelings. It's about what they thought at the time. And they thought this was odd. The way Leanne was found and the injuries to her were so violent that they had a hard time understanding how the person that was with her the whole time didn't know how they happened. It would be hard to imagine that you would be with somebody through these kinds of injuries and somehow miss them occurring. So they bring him back in and they question Jason again a couple times. They have multiple interviews with him, and his story starts to evolve a little bit, is probably the best way to put it. During a subsequent interview, he tells the investigators that during the drive home from the bar, Leanne told him she needed to urinate. I have to pee, right? And that she got out of the car while it was still moving. He estimated that the car was probably moving at about 5 miles an hour. It's not that fast, but basically that she got out, she may have fallen. Maybe she hit her head. Maybe that's where the road rash came from. But they ask him, well, why didn't you mention this the first night when we were talking to you about this? And you said you couldn't tell where those injuries came from. You really had no answer for that. And now you're remembering this very interesting part of your night where she fell out of a moving car. Like it's, you have to wonder how someone forgets that. Again, it's conceivable they were drinking. It must have been a confusing night, but when you're an investigator, these are the kinds of things that start to look like, I'd like to know more about that, because it's hard to imagine if I'm having a night, even after a couple drinks, if my ex-wife falls out of a moving vehicle and later dies, I'm not going to connect the two. When someone asks me about, hey, where'd the injuries come from? Oh, well, an hour ago she fell out of a moving car. But that is the answer, right? And there's nothing to necessarily disprove it at this point. They have to take Jason at his word because no one else was there. Miles, let's talk though about the cause of death, right? Which was blunt force trauma to the head, because I think the crux of this whole story is, was this an accidental injury that occurred falling out of a car, or in some other way that maybe Jason didn't see or wasn't there for? Did she slip and hit her head on the home and he missed it? Or is there more to the story and there's something more nefarious going on? So let's talk
That's
about
right.
it.
Yeah. So as Sean said, the medical examiner determines that the cause of death is blunt force trauma to the head. That's what's on that's what's on the death certificate. That is the official determination. That's the cause of death. So the police who interviewed the first responders, the police who interviewed Jason, the police who did this full investigation into everything, examined all the evidence on the scene, watched all the body cam footage, everything else. Those investigators, after doing a thorough investigation of the circumstances surrounding Leanne Beck's death, those police recommend that homicide charges be brought against Jason Beck. That is their recommendation to the prosecutors in Maricopa County. Now, the prosecutors in Maricopa County, after examining everything that the police give to them, declined to prosecute. And their official statement is there was no reasonable likelihood of conviction. Again, I'm going to say that again. The statement from the prosecutors in Maricopa County is there is no reasonable likelihood of conviction. I think that's really, really important. It's very specific wording, and I think it's really important that we all think about that. Now, what does that mean? Sean and I have mentioned, I think we mentioned at the top, when we did the intro, that we have both run into cases in our careers of, producing and covering, mostly murders in cases for both of us, that sometimes if the prosecutors just feel like they don't have it, they're not going to take the time and they're not going to spend the public funds to go after something that they know they're not going to get a conviction on. Now, does that mean that they don't believe the person that has been recommended for prosecution is guilty? Not necessarily. What it means is that they think that something's missing and there's enough doubt around it that a jury trial is not going to bring a conviction, right? Now, sometimes they hold off on that prosecution because they think that perhaps something will come up later and that will give them that piece that they're missing. And they don't want to blow the chance because they can't try someone twice, right? So you can't be tried for the same murder twice. So what they're doing is they're waiting to see if more evidence comes out and they're holding on to that chance that perhaps they can prosecute later down the line, right? Then there's also the cases where they're just like, we just don't have it. And then there's cases where they just feel like, this wasn't a murder. So we don't feel that this person should be prosecuted for murder. I think what's interesting here in this case is that the police, who did do a very thorough examination of everything, did determine, in their view, that Jason Beck should be prosecuted for murder. And I think it's interesting to note that the cause of death on the death certificate is not deemed accidental. It's deemed blunt force trauma to the head. And Sean, there's another part in the death certificate that's like blank, right?
Yeah, it's undetermined, right? I think it said the manner of death. So the cause of
Manner
death
of
is
death.
blunt
Manner of
force
death.
trauma.
Cause of death is blunt force trauma to the head. Manner of death is undetermined, which means that they don't know how she got that, right? So there's some reasonable doubt around how Leanne got that injury to the head. And you can, extrapolate on that as much as you want. You can go back and you can look at Jason's multiple interviews with the police and the story that he eventually landed on, where Leanne had said that she had to urinate and he slowed the car down to pull over and she jumped out before he stopped the car. I mean, I guess that explains the road rash. Does it explain the lump on the back of her head? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. I haven't spoken to the ME, and I haven't spoken to the cops. We have sent some emails. Maybe we will speak to somebody. We'll see. I think what's important here is that there's people out there, people that you're going to see interviews with, who really, really cared about Leanne, who want this story told. They wanted us to cover it. They wanted to bring it to as many people as possible, and they want you guys to hear it. So there's the people who originally came to us, who really, really care, and then there's the people that they connected with us, who are Leanne's friends, who you're going to see these interviews with, right? So I think for those people, and for me too, at this point, I can speak for Sean too, that he also wants these questions answered. There's some major questions that are out there that, I think it's important that we put them out and we say, what are the reasons for this, right? So number one, right? What happened between Leanne and Jason leaving the bar and them getting to Jason's house? So the surveillance footage that we've seen shows that they're totally fine when they're at the bar. Leanne has no injuries. There's no fighting going on. There's no physicality happening, right? But somewhere between that and them being in that home, she suffered injuries that caused her death. Okay. So what happened? What exactly happened in between that bar and, her laying dead and cold when those first responders showed up, right? Why was the text message about Leanne having stomach problems sent 20 minutes before the call to 911? Now, from what we understand, investigators reportedly determined that that message was probably not written by Leanne.
It is. I think you're right. I think this is a really interesting point here. And who sent that text is kind of important, right? And we'll tell you, and you'll see in the interviews with her friends. Her friends didn't feel like that came from her either. They said that that type of text, especially at that time and about that thing, didn't make a lot of sense. If Leanne wanted to call in sick, she wouldn't have been doing it like that, right? She would not be texting them about it. There was another protocol for that. So stay tuned for more on that, but that is an important moment there. Anyway, go ahead, Miles. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's it. I think those are the big questions. What happened between leaving the bar and getting to the house?
Mm-hmm.
Why this 20-minute lag? between sending a text message that's saying I have stomach problems to a frantic call to 911, she's not breathing, to when the EMTs show up, she's already a cold dead corpse that's been that way for a while. That's a very strange timeline, and I
Yeah.
think that deserves an examination and some answers. And then yeah, her personal belongings. It's these are the things that are hanging over this case that you just kind of have to scratch your head. And look, when you look back at the history there, and when you look at what the police recommendation was to the prosecutors, there's a lot to think about. And I think that explains why Sean and I have chosen to cover this case, because it warrants a discussion. Let's put it that way. And the people that you're going to see who we interviewed, they deserve a platform. In my feeling is that they deserve people to listen to them and to have their point of view put out there. And I want to hear what you guys think. Honestly, that's I want to know what our audience thinks about Leanne Beck's death. And I guarantee you, Sean, that people are going to have some opinions. I guarantee that we're going to get comments on this, and that in a couple of days we're going to be filming a comment reaction video where we're reacting to all of the thoughts that our audience has about Leanne Beck. And I wouldn't be surprised, because this usually happens when we cover a case, that people from the area watch this and they have information. They have, whether those are rumors, whether those are, actual facts, whatever. There's going to be more stuff that comes out from people watching this and from people, letting us know what they know about the case. So I think that's why we're doing this. That's why we do this in general. So guys, have at it. Let us know what you think. And if there's anybody watching who's from the area that has their own thoughts on this, or their own inside information or history from the area, anything like that, please feel free to comment. Let's talk about it.
Absolutely. And I think what's important to sort of close on here is to remember that Miles and I are not even asserting that we think this is a homicide. We are simply looking at this medical examiner's report where it says that it's undetermined what happened to Leanne. And that is what bothers her friends and her family. They don't know. Nobody knows what really happened. There's no satisfactory answer here. So just to be clear, we're not couching this as they should have taken this to court and prosecuted it as a homicide. We're saying, how come this information is still missing? If it was an accident, why can't we have that explained to us, right? We have other cases we've touched, like Chance Engelbert, where they do have the remains, but the explanation is missing for how it got there. And I do feel like whatever the answer is with Leanne here, we're not really there yet. And so it may be a closed case as far as whether or not it's going to be prosecuted as a homicide, but I don't think it's a closed case as far as public interest in what actually happened to this young woman. Keep in mind, guys, she has two children who are going to grow up and wonder, what happened to my mom, And for people to forget and to have it not looked into and to have like no satisfactory explanation for that is a tragedy for both of them and for everybody who loved Leanne. So please understand, we're coming at it from that angle. There may be a nefarious resolution to this. There may be a completely, normal, plausible one that's an accident, and the point is we don't know. So normally you try to find those answers in court. That's not happening in this case. So it's really the best I think that can be done for Leanne is for people who care about cases like these to talk about them, to discuss them, to keep her story alive, like Miles said. So with that being said, we're going to bring you deeper into Leanne's life and the circumstances surrounding her death by interviewing her friends over the next couple of weeks, who are going to tell you much, much more about her as a person and her life and how this has affected everyone. Much more than you're going to hear from just Miles and I giving you the sort of book report version of these cases that we call the case breakdown, right? So stay tuned for that. And then, Miles, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap it up
Well,
today?
yeah, I would just say, as always, guys, if you like what we're doing, consider subscribing. If you really like what we're doing, become a member. Give us a little bit of support. It will help us keep this thing going. And, drop us a comment, hit the notifications bell, boost us a little bit in the algorithm, help us get these stories out to a wider audience. As always, thank you everybody for watching. Thank you for all of our members, all of our regulars who are in there commenting. We appreciate you guys, and we'll see you on the next one.